Hey everyone, today we're going to be looking at the V-Ray physical camera in Maya. We're going to be focusing on techniques and concepts that go over the focal length, the f number, shutter speed, and ISO, and how all of that ties into the exposure, as well as white balance. We are of course going to be looking into the effect of f number and aperture on the depth of field, how the shutter speed affects the motion blur, and how to combine those techniques with the ultimate goal being able to have complete control over the physical camera to create compelling, appealing, well composited, compositioned images for 3D art. All right, so let's go ahead and get started. So let's go ahead and just jump into Maya here. So here I have this 3D scene. It's just this 2 scale toy train with some bubbles. It is animating throughout the scene, little bubbles based off of a particle simulation that are popping out of the train here. And we got some props in the background like a toy plane, toy trees, and all of that with some basic V-Ray lights to kind of help fill up the light with scenes. Regarding our render settings, I'm just going to be using um, these settings here, and I'll go ahead and just jump to progressive to iterate at the beginning, and then I have GI set up with irradiance map and light cache, and so we can iterate faster. Let's just go ahead and change irradiance map to low, and we're going to lower our light cache settings to 500. And with all of that being done, let's now jump into setting up some cameras. All right. So right off the bat, I want to make sure that we understand kind of the goal here. So if I jump over here, and this is a key terminology that we're going to be focusing on, all right? And this is some really great V-Ray documentation here. Again, we're going to be focusing on focal length. We're going to be focusing on aperture. We're going to be looking at ISO or ISO, shutter speed, and white balance. The first thing that we're going to cover is focal length and how that affects our initial scene setup. So I'll just start by creating a brand new camera. All right, so if I go ahead here to panels in the viewport and perspective and just create a new camera, we'll see that we have a brand new camera created. All right, now I am going to go ahead and turn on resolution gate so we can kind of see the everything without any clipping. And then we can see our camera here in the viewport. Now, if you wanted to change the locator size of this camera, you can hit Control A to toggle and jump to the channel box editor. If you don't have that up, then just hit this icon over here on the right and then change the locator size to something much larger. I'll just go ahead and set it to something like 10. All right. Now that we have that, let's go ahead and position our camera. So ideally, right off the bat, we see that we have already a pretty good position. And if I start altering the focal length, I have to first apply a V-Ray physical camera attribute. Now you can, of course, use the default Maya. You can actually tell V-Ray to use these camera controls, but I'm just going to go ahead and go to attributes here in the attribute editor, V-Ray, and apply a V-Ray physical camera. So we see that a V-Ray, or an extra V-Ray attribute has been applied to the camera here. So I'll just go ahead and actually call this render cam main. All right, and expand extra V-Ray attributes, and we can see that here at the top of the list we have our film gate resolution, and this is where we can change the focal length. Now again, what is focal length? Well, if I go ahead and change specify FOV, sometimes they're used interchangeably with FOV, which is just field of view, and focal length. I'm actually going to set this to off so I can just change the settings here. Now the focal length is set to 35, which is, fairly neutral. And if I go ahead and lower this value, notice what starts to happen here. If I start to get to like 15 and 20, it's not just zooming the camera back, it's actually expanding or increasing the length of the lens. So you can see here now that I've set this to something like 15, we can start to see what's happening, right? So with 15, things are we start to get a lot of perspective distortion. And what ends up happening is the distance between the objects starts to increase, right? So if I go ahead and jump this to something now from 15 to 50, notice what happens. It zooms into the image here. And if I zoom back out to kind of frame the whole train again, we can start to see that it's compressing the it's starting to compress the distance between all the objects. Now, if these cameras are getting in the way, because I have a lot of camera setups, we can just go to show here and disable camera. So now we can see that without the obstruction of the cameras. All right. Even more so, if I increase this, right, to something more extreme like 200, it does it even more. So again, it starts to give us this kind of telephoto uh, compression, and it almost starts to look orthographic as you start to get to the extremes here. Now, for more examples, I highly recommend going to Google and looking up the focal length examples, right? So here you can see 18 millimeter, 24, and it gets progressively larger all the way up to 300 millimeters. So here you see the entire environment, the entire landscape, all the way down to 105. You start to really zoom in, right? So again, this is increasing the length of the lens on our camera, all right? Now, if I jump here, again, you can kind of see just a recap of what I'm explaining. If the camera stays in the same position and we increase the focal length, we're essentially zooming in and removing any distortion, all right? So this gives us a lot of control on how we render and view our scenes. For more expansive, larger environments, you'd probably want to use something like 20, between 20, 15, 25. But for here, I'm going to go ahead and actually show my V-Ray frame buffer. And I have a lot of these samples already rendered out so you can see what it looks like. So here we're looking at a focal length of 20, a focal length of 50, and a focal length of 200, right? And with each progression of focal length there between 20, 50, and 200, you can see again, if we look at the distance between these tires or these wheels on the train, you can see how the distance is actually starting to increase, right? And again, the lower the focal length, the more perspective distortion that you have. So for something like, the human eye is going to range between 35 and 50, 55 millimeters focal length. So for a lot of my shots, I typically start with 50 and kind of work from there. All right, great. So hopefully that gave you a good summary and explanation on what focal length is. So that's always the first thing that I set up right out the gate. Okay, so now that I've gone over focal length, the next important one, well, I'd say they're all equally important, but we're going to be looking at the F number or aperture. So F number here, if we take a look, an aperture is the opening to the camera lens, okay? So the thing to keep in mind here is that the larger the F number, the smaller the hole, all right? So you can see here at F22, it's very small. You almost get a pinhole. At F2, 2.8, F4, 2.8, 1.8, you get a much, much larger opening, and it's just going to bring in so much more light. Now, this also plays a huge role in depth of field, which we're going to get to shortly. Right now, I'm just going to be looking at this from an exposure standpoint. So with this applied, right, I'm actually going to go ahead and disable treat as V-Ray physical camera, and let's just go ahead and do a quick render. So if I go ahead and do a render, I want to go ahead and make sure to set this good. So set to main cam, and we can see that things are fairly dim right out the gate, and I have no exposure controls here. Instead of adjusting the lights, I can go ahead now and adjust my exposure settings through my physical camera. So I'll go ahead and enable treat as physical camera. I have all of the default settings here, and I'll just go ahead and render. So I'll go ahead and render, and now right out the gate you can see it's very dark. All right, now again, going back to our image here, F8 is a very small hole, so it's not letting a lot of light in. So if I want to let more light into the scene, I can lower the F number. So if I go ahead and hit F number and type in something like 4, and then now I go ahead and start to render again, you can see that now I'm getting a little bit more light coming into my camera, right? So we're starting kind of here, and we're getting a little bit more light, and I can even, if I wanted to, type in something like F number 1.8, so something really low, and that's going to brighten up our scene even more, all right? So we're off to a good start so far. And what I'm going to do is actually set this F number to something more in the middle here. I'm going to set it to about 4, or F number of 4. And then we're going to go ahead and start looking to our other settings. So you can see here, just recapping, F number of 1.4, F number is 2.8. As you increase the F number, the opening or the aperture gets smaller. So we have to compensate. And one of the good ways to compensate is to use ISO or ISO. So if I go ahead now and let's jump to ISO. Now what ISO is that is the camera's sensitivity to light. So right now it's set to 100. Now if I go ahead and crank this up to something like 600, the sensor in the camera will become more sensitive. Now, since we're doing this in 3D, we don't have to worry about some limitations to the camera. So go ahead and render that. And we can see kind of the difference so far. Right now it's really subtle, so we're going to have to look into other settings here. I will go ahead and maybe position this, kind of frame this a little bit better, so we get something like that. So you can kind of see what we're looking at. And I will set this focal length to about 50 to get a bit less distortion. So we can still get the whole train in here without having any distortion and without compressing it too much. All right, great. So far I've changed the F number to 4 to open it up a little bit, and then I set ISO to 600. Now we're going to need to bring in more light still. So one of the good ways to do that is the third property of a camera, right? And so the thing you also have to keep in mind actually for ISO, now in the digital world, we're lucky, we can set ISO to like 2400, something extreme, and we don't get any issues right now, right? Like that looks great, right? We can crank this ISO up and it gives us a well balanced and well exposed image. Now, in the real world, camera sensors are, they're built to have specific ratings with ISO, and so sometimes if you crank it up that high, you start to get grain and noise in the image. So that's just one thing to keep in mind if you go look at that in the real world. Okay. So the third option uh, or setting is shutter speed. So what I'm going to do is set ISO back to 400, and now we're going to take a look at shutter speed. So again, recapping ISO, we have ISO 20 and 1.5, so a bit extreme, and you can see how lowering ISO will darken it. Now we're going to look at shutter speed, and this is the shutter of the camera. So right in front of the sensor, in between the lens, you have the lens, the shutter, then the sensor, and in between the lens and the sensor, we have the shutter. All right. So what we can do is change the speed at which this stays open. So if I go ahead and just kind of do a quick re-render here, and we'll kind of see where our light's at, we can see that it's still fairly dark. Well, right now, keep in mind that shutter speed is inverse. So it's set to 1 over 200. So that means if I actually set this to 1 over 20, the speed at which this uh, of the shutter has now slowed down significantly, which means that if the shutter stays open longer, it's letting in way more light into the camera. So you can see how setting the shutter speed really is bringing in a lot of light. And inversely, if I really crank this up to, you know, 600 or something a lot higher, right, we're going to get something that looks way darker. Okay, so just keep that in mind. If we want to keep the shutter open longer, we have to lower the speed since it's an inverse value. And then you can even go as far as, remember it's 1 over 1 or 1 over 4 here. So you can see it just starts to get blindingly bright. So we'll definitely set this back up to something like 20, and that gives us good, well-balanced light. So with the 3 settings that we have, I'll go ahead and jump back to Google, and we can see that we have aperture, which is f number, shutter speed, and ISO. And those are the 3 settings that you're going to be always modifying to get a well-balanced image. Now, the first thing I always recommend is adjust aperture because that's going to be dependent on whether or not you want depth of field, which we're about to look into. Then look at shutter speed, which if you need motion blur, that would be next. And then I would always leave ISO for last. And between those three, again, you're going to get a really good, well, well lit image. All right. So I'm going to jump back here. We can see that we modified the F number, the shutter speed, and then ISO. Okay. So if now let's start seeing how F number is going to tie into depth of field. All right. So with this example here, we can see that we have a focal length of 50 and we have depth of field enabled. All right. The next thing I want to do is go to my physical camera attributes here. So if you clicked off or you're not there, remember just you can use this camera setting here in the viewport, which will directly take you to camera attributes, or select your camera and you can hit Control A to pop up attribute if you're not seeing it. So now that we see it here, we can go ahead and scroll down and we can see that enable depth of field and enable motion blur are not enabled by default. So let's just go ahead and enable it, and let's go ahead and do a new render. So with a new render happening, here we go. Going to let it do its thing, and we can see right out the gate that things just immediately start to look blurry. So we need to help the camera and tell it where to focus on. Because what's happening now is that it's blurring in front and it's blurring behind, and it's keeping the center of the train in focus is what it's typically going to do. So the reason that's happening here, if I jump back to Google and we look at camera depth of field, I really like this image here, okay? Because what this shows you is that essentially you have a shallow depth of field, so a low or very short depth of field, so the focus is going to be very small. And then as you increase the F number, you're going to get a larger depth of field, so more things will be in focus. All right. So again, so for here, and just like with the camera, we actually need to tell it where to focus. So I have this camera selected here. What I want to do is go to Create, Measure Tools, and go to our Distance tool. So before I select our Distance tool, take a look at where the pivot of the camera is. That's the point of the camera that we want to measure the distance from. So it's not the front of the camera, it's right here where the lens would be, or the sensor would be. So again, Create, Measure Tools, Distance. So, we want to get pretty close here. I'm going to go ahead, hit right about there, and then I'm going to select this train here, and then now you can see I have 98.3, 0.299, right? So great. So why did I do that? Well, now if I go to my render camera again and enable specify focus, and I type in this value now, 98.3, under focus distance, that's going to tell the camera where it should be focusing. Again, I'm focusing it right on the front of this train. So if I go ahead and render, let's see what happens. Okay, so let GI kind of calculate there, and there we go. So we're starting to get this front of the train in focus while everything else is really starting to blur. So this is great, right? So what control does this give us? Well, now you can see if I go down here with these depth of fields, and all I did was add these comments in. These weren't generated by Maya or V-Ray. So if you right click edit comment, if you want to keep track, you can just kind of type in some notes so you can view later. All right, so I'll save and close. So again, if I look at this camera that I rendered before with the focal F number of 4, and once I let it render with bucket, things kind of cleaned up really nice. All right. Well, if I go ahead and lower the F number, we get a much more, we get an even more shallow depth of field, and more things, they blur even more, is what I'm trying to say, right? Now, in the opposite direction, if I go up an F number, right, we have a larger depth of field, so less things are going to be blurry and more things are going to be in focus. Now, to fully get rid of it, you'd have to probably go up to well over, F number 16 or something like that. So you can see the difference if I go again between this shot here with the 50 millimeter no depth of field. And now if I go to, so I'll set this to A, all right? And I'm gonna go to the F number 8 with depth of field and set that to B. And then now I can kind of scrub and we can see the difference between the two. So no depth of field at all. And here's a subtle depth of field effect. We can see it really starting to come into effect at the farther um, props, and it's a subtle blur, but it really adds to the scene. And what this is doing, it's allowing you as the artist to let the audience and viewer focus on something that you want them to focus on, right? So again, remember, it's kind of the window into your 3D scene, the window into your art. So this can definitely help you kind of tell your story. So if we want to take a look at an F number that's lower. So in this case, I'm going to jump to an F number from 8.0 to an F number of 4. We start to get even more blurry, and then even more so if I click on F number of 2, it gets even blurrier yet. So you can see the difference there. And you can even see as we really start to lower that F number, it really starts to blur even almost the front of the train as well. All right, so a lot of power there in the depth of field. I also highly recommend that you take a look at more documentation as far as what the effect that Aperture has on depth of field. I really highly recommend Chris Bray's photography channel. He does a fantastic job just really breaking down the impact of Aperture and the F number on depth of field. So you can see here he goes from a very um, shallow, right? So low F number is a shallow or short depth of field, which ties to the low number of F, the F number. And then as it increases, right, so the F number becomes larger, so F22, you now get a larger depth of field here. So he does a fantastic job. So I highly recommend you take a look at his complete course on photography, which directly applies to everything that we're doing here with the V-Ray physical camera. All right. So now that we've looked at that, let's go ahead and look at how shutter speed impacts motion blur. So if I go ahead and move my camera, the obvious thing is that with motion blur, you need an object that is moving. So you can see here, I have this train moving, and I'm going to move it about middle of the way here, right about frame 90, and kind of frame it in there. And now that I have that, I want to go ahead and actually disable depth of field for the sake of render times, enable motion blur, and then now we're going to see the impact that shutter speed has on this. So now that I've gone ahead and done that, let's go ahead and render. Oops, and let me just go ahead and change that to my main render camera main. And we can see that now the front of the train is really starting to blur thanks to motion blur. Okay, so it's starting to look really good and it's blurring actually quite a bit, right? So if we wanted some more control over that, this is where you would start, messing with these values. It's just like with depth of field. So I'm going to turn off the A/B comparison here and yeah, turn that off there. And the thing to keep in mind is so for depth of field, as I was changing the F numbers, I had to change the shutter speed and ISO to compensate for the exposure differences. So again, if I look at an F number of 2, so very open aperture, my ISO, I had to lower my ISO a bit to compensate. So if now that I increase my F number, so the aperture opening becomes smaller, I had to, so there's less light coming in, I had to increase ISO to compensate for that. So again, and if here, in the opposite direction, now that I'm letting a lot of light in, I have a lot of depth of field, I had to lower my ISO. So the same thing is happening here. So if I go ahead back now to my camera here, we're going to go ahead and find the motion blur. So I'm going to scroll back to the top. We can see that we're starting to get a lot. Now, if I want this to have motion blur, but not to this extent, well, I can increase shutter speed. So this is going to increase the speed so that of the shutter, which means that there's going to be less blur. Okay, so let's say I set this a shutter speed of 100 and I'm in position there. Great. I go ahead and do that, and then you're going to notice it's a lot darker, right? So again, we're compensating here. We have to compensate with these other settings. So you can see that there's a little bit of a blur. Well, if I'm like, oh, that's a little bit too much, I want to bring some more back. You can of course play with that setting there. So I lower it even more to slow down the shutter speed. Remember, it's inverse, so it's 1/80. So the lower that this value is, the slower that my shutter is. And I start to get some nice blur there. Great, but now it's a bit dark. So if you take a look at these examples, I have down here with motion blur, I think I use a shutter speed of 60 and ISO of 800, so I really need to start cranking this ISO up. So I'll probably, since I'm using a shutter speed of 80, I'll just go ahead and increase the ISO to about 1,000, right? Because let's say I'm happy with the depth of field, I don't want to mess that up. Well, my next option is to increase ISO. And so you can see now I start to get a lot more light in here now that I've really cranked up my ISO. And of course, if I want to keep, motion blur and depth of field, well, since I've moved this camera now, right? So here we are, I need to do another measure of the position of this camera to about either the front here or the center of this object here, and it's about 80.6. So if I go to render cam main and type in the 80.6 value, and I go ahead and enable motion or motion blur and depth of field, you can start to see I can get both of those effects happening at the same time like you would in real life, and it's starting to look really good and really interesting. Keep in mind, these are not cheap at all, right? By having depth of field and by having motion blur, it's going to noticeably and significantly increase render times. So I'm going to go ahead and actually stop that. So you can see it's cleaning up really nice. I'll go ahead and stop that. And I have some samples down here that kind of show the differences, right? So if I go down to about here, I have depth of field. Okay, so here we are. So this is kind of back to reset. This is in the middle of the animation. And with motion blur enabled, an f number of 4, shutter speed of 60, and ISO of 800. I really had to bring up that ISO. You can see we start to get some nice blur. Okay, great. Well then, I want even more blur, so I lower the shutter speed, so it's slowing it down, so we're going to get more blur, which is bringing in more light. Well, I had to lower the ISO, so ISO is now 300. We're getting a lot of blur here. And if I think I kept the shutter speed here at 60 and enable depth of field, you start to see the difference, right? So if I go ahead and look at this plain Jane image here, and I set this to A, and I set this one to B, we can look at the difference between this image here with the full-blown motion blur and depth of field, and then we have none going on there. All right, so and you of course can see the differences in render times between this. This is just 3 minutes right out the gate, and this is almost 5 minutes. So again, it is a noticeable amount to add to your render times. Okay, so that about does it for aperture, shutter speed, and ISO with exposure, depth of field, and motion blur. The last topic I wanted to cover was white balance. What I'm going to do now is select the camera that I've enabled in the viewport, which is this render cam narrow focal length 50. And we're going to go to the camera attribute settings and we will go down to white balance. And here in this dialog, we will select this checkerboard to plug in a V-ray temperature. So just type in temp, you can see V-ray temperature, and then now I have this here, okay? And I can change this to temperature, and I can go ahead and do a quick render. I'll go ahead and actually increase it so we have a noticeable difference. And you can see as I start to increase the temperature, we start to get a much warmer render, okay? So that's a good example there. In the opposite direction, as I drop this, lower the temperature, we get a cooler. Now you're essentially going to get the inverse of what you see here. Now, why do you want to have the white balance? Well, a lot of times you want to make sure to use white balance to fine tune and create a neutral render. So you can do color balance changes after the fact and do that during the color correction process in post, right? So for example, again, if I go ahead and probably make something a little bit more neutral and we're happy with that, you can start to see that it's starting to come out even a little bit more warm. So you can play with these settings to get something more neutral. So if I actually show you here, there's the show corrections control. So now I have white balance here. So this is what I mean, like you can change this in the post. So now you can see that it becomes much more neutral. So you can change that wherever you want, whether you do it in the camera settings or change it in the V-Ray frame buffer, what have you. And the last thing I wanted to show quickly is the overrides for your camera. So V-Ray added this auto exposure and auto white balance, so that's kind of nice. So you can play with that. If you're having, let's say, a hard time just really nailing down the exposure, this is where these two settings are going to come into play and help you out until you really learn how to adjust these settings. So if I go to render cam main again, I'm actually going to break the connection here, remove any white balance that I had and just set it to pure white. And I will have auto exposure, auto white balance. And let's just go ahead and see what uh, V-Ray is going to do here. So I'll change this to render cam main. And we can see that this is what we get. I will go ahead and just kind of move this camera back into position here. And you can see that it's kind of created this really almost cooler version of this render. And you can kind of let that go through for a little bit. Let V-Ray clean that up. And then what I can do is transfer the selected attribute so we can actually see what it's going to change. It's typically what I've noticed is it changes ISO. So if I go transfer selected with the camera selected, you have to do a render first and then transfer selected to camera. You can see that it actually really brought in some coolness there and tried to adjust the white balance automatically. Okay. Keep in mind you do need uh, light cache irradiance map with this. Nope, you just need light cache as the GI. Okay, so just make sure you have light cache in order to get this override to work. So if you're using brute force or something, that's why you're not seeing that there. All right, so and of course you can change that, adjust it if you wanted to make it even more so neutral there. All right, so again, we went ahead and covered all of these topics here today with focal length, perspective distortion, aperture, ISO, shutter speed, white balance, and how all of that ties together to create a really nice, well-exposed image that allows your user to focus on things that you want them to focus on, right? So make sure to always spend some time on the camera. And last bit here is make sure to look at the documentation. They have some really good examples here, real-time examples, or I would say interactive, I want to call them real-time. You can see how things like zoom factor, how exposure controls F number, right? So like we were saying, increase the F number, your image is going to be darker, your opening is going to be smaller. Lower the F number, larger opening. All right, so lots of cool stuff here, so do take a look at that. As usual, if you have any questions, comments, please drop them down below in the comments. Like and subscribe is always appreciated. Thanks, everyone. Take care.